Well, we have an exciting night tonight. Apart from our usual mammals or, well, we've had fungi and next month is lichens. Part algae, part, I just looked it up, algae and bacteria and fungi. It's gonna be interesting. March 6th. Anyway, thanks for coming. We are, you know our history. We formed right after the 2013 flood in order to bring back the watershed in all its beauty. We added big boulders to form meanders back into the streams. And now, today, we are working on fire mitigation. So if you have property around that you're afraid about, has a lot of dead wood, call us. We may be able to include your property in a grant. That's how we survive, with grants, and that's where you come in, because sometimes the grants, well, not sometimes, usually the grants ask for matching funds. So that's where we get donations and private grants to help us meet those requirements. So we count on you and appreciate all you do for us. Let's see, I was going to talk about, coming up, you should know about our symposium coming up in May 10th, and that's wolves. It's called Myth and Magic.
From myth to reality, wolves in modern ecosystem.
Thank you. From myth to reality, finish the sentence.
Right.
Oh, there it is.
Right there.
There it is. Anyway, that's gonna be fantastic. The keynote speaker is from Yellowstone. So that's gonna be a doozy. We're always looking for board members. We have a couple of that are gonna drop out this year. So if you'd like to join us, we'd love to have you. I'm looking at you all.
Making eye contact.
And tonight we have a really interesting speaker, Stefan Ekernas from the Denver Zoo. And he's on a mission to rehab the habitats and their genetic makeup to get them to survive in the wild again. Fascinating talk.
Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to speak here. I'm going to try to ride the very fine line of being loud enough that I can be heard on Zoom, where it sounds like I was very quiet and not blowing your eardrums out. So hopefully I'll get that right, but if I need to be louder or less loud, please let me know. So I'm going to switch over to this. Oh, it's working. Good. Step one, success. So hi everybody. I'm really delighted to be up here. My name is Stefan Ekernas. I'm the director of Colorado Field Conservation at Denver Zoo Conservation Alliance. So Denver Zoo spends about $2 million a year on field conservation efforts, half international and half here in Colorado. And so I have colleagues who run the international side, and I get to run our local side, which is awesome because Colorado is a pretty great place to be. So and one of the things that we are working on is boreal toads, which is the talk today, and really the kind of conservation strategies for what to do with a species on the brink. And you could, another title that we could call this is How to Save a Species from Extinction, hopefully, or at least maybe Stefan's approach to trying to save a species from going locally extinct. I'm going to start very broad. We're going to talk geology. So there's a paradigm in geology that change is either big and then it's slow, or if it's fast, it's small. So think about like tectonic plates. Big, tectonic, right? Like continental scale moves at millimeters per year. Versus small changes, they can happen fast. So think of volcano, single mountain, it could be a rapid change, but it's small, right? It's nowhere near the size of this continent. But sometimes that paradigm is broken, right? And that's happened about 5 times, we're in the 6th one now, so now 6 times in the history of life on the planet. And those are, when that happens, so famously, like you have an asteroid hitting, that's a big change that happened fast. 65 million years ago, you get spasms of extinction. You're changing the entire life of the planet, really rapidly changing conditions. Life can't keep up, right? It was 252 million years ago, it was the Great Dying. 96% of all species went extinct. All life on the planet almost ended. That was a result of a series of volcanoes that exploded, rapidly changed climate change, caused ocean acidification, all kinds of stuff. So, big and fast leads to bad things. And of course, big and fast is what humanity is tremendously good at. So I was reading this book, there's a great book, it came out maybe 10 years ago, The Sixth Extinction, and it's about, so the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, that analyzes species across the globe, and essentially 28% of all species on the planet are threatened with extinction, including 41% of amphibians. When I was reading this book, my mom was like, hey, what book are you reading? And I was like, oh, it's about how, almost a third of species on the planet are going extinct. And she said, oh, it's science fiction? And I was like, oh, I wish, Mom. That's why I do what I do. But it's true, right? There's like great wisdom in that. Like it does sound like science fiction, right? Like it's not just numbers, these are like terrible consequences, right? We are the asteroid. There's a paradigm, but just like there's a paradigm in geology about change being big and slow, or fast and small, there's also a paradigm in conservation. And the paradigm is that the animals are never the problem. The animals are never the problem, right? This toad here, look at it sitting in thousands of eggs. The animals are fine, but the people are always the problem, right? This was kind of a rude surprise to me when I was like 5 years into my PhD, and they were like, hey, it's always the people that are the problem. And I was like, but I don't know how to solve people. Like, I'm getting a PhD in animals. Like, what do you mean? They're like, I need another PhD now suddenly? So, anyway, so this is the thing, right? It is always the fact that when we're dealing with conservation problems, it's always some consequence of some direct or indirect effect, right? There's the kind of acronym for how, like the mechanisms by which people screw up the planet, is HIPPO, so it's like habitat loss and fragmentation, invasive species, where we move things around the planet really rapidly, pollution, and overharvest are the kind of big categories of stuff that would causes bad things to happen. And so we're going to dive into one of those today. There's an amphibian apocalypse really happening, and it's caused by this flesh-eating fungus. It eats the keratinized skin of amphibians, and it's called Batrachochytridium dendrobatitis, which is a mouthful, so I'm going to call it BD, or chytrid for the rest of this talk, for short. It is an invasive species, so it's essentially a fungus that came from somewhere in Eurasia, and in 2018 is when this National Geographic article was written about the scientific finding that essentially it looks like the original sin was the Korean War. So chytrid fungus, what it does, so it eats the keratinized skin of amphibians, and it basically breaks down the skin and causes all kinds of bad things to happen to amphibians. It causes mast cell. And how it works is it gives off spores. So it lives on the skin of amphibians and then gives off spores, and those spores persist in mud. And so, like the Korean War, we were very good at moving mud around, right? There's soldiers digging trenches, there's muddy boots, there's tanks, there's mud, and then they're going back to bases in Germany and Europe and North America and all over the world, right? So they're taking this mud and moving it all over the place from Korea, right? And that was what looks like to have been the original sin that causes outbreak. And it's now caused over 90 species of amphibians to go extinct. And the question is, are boreal toads next? which brings us to our protagonist. Anaxyrus boreas. So it's a western toad. The boreal toad is a subspecies of the western toad, hence the 3 names there. It's a really cool little guy. So Colorado's the only high altitude toad. So they live in wetlands from 8,000 to 12,000 feet, which for you think for an ectotherm, like a cold-blooded animal, like that's quite an accomplishment, right? To live at 12,000 feet. Like I don't find it very comfortable at 12,000 feet in winter, right? And to be cold-blooded is pretty remarkable. So there are other amphibians up there, but it's our only toad at high altitude. And it was formerly abundant. So there are reports from like the 70s, from Buena Vista, and they were just sitting like under street lights. They used to be like all under street lights in town, just picking off flies. And now they're really tanking. So they're already extirpated, so locally extinct in New Mexico. There are no boreal toads left. And in Colorado, there's only about, probably as low as, potentially as low as 800 individuals. Right? For context, we have 300,000 elk. Right? So 800 toads is a catastrophic number. So we're down there, you know, they're hanging on by a Ziploc bag and a Pizzola scale in the state. It's not good. They were petitioned to be listed under the Endangered Species Act and rejected in 2017. And the reason they were rejected is kind of twofold reasons. So one is that populations in Alaska are doing just fine. And also they're doing okay down into like British Columbia and down into the Pacific Northwest, they're doing better. And there's not enough of a, even though we have a unique subspecies here, there's not enough genetic differentiation, so it's not a evolutionarily distinct unit under the ESA. It's not sufficiently unique to be called worthwhile being listed under the ESA. So essentially, what that means is that like the state does on our own. So how wildlife works here in the state, here in the US, in the States is that like different entities can own land, right? Private individuals, federal government, whoever, right, can own land. But the wildlife that walks on top of the land is owned by the state, right? Just because you own a piece of property doesn't mean that you own the deer, right? The state owns deer. But there's an exception to that when the state does not own the wildlife, and that's federally endangered species. So ESA listed species go into the jurisdiction of the federal government. And that brings a lot of resources in, right? And so when you get these species that are not quite endangered enough, right, to be federally listed, they kind of end up in this opposite of a sweet spot, right? They don't get the resources to actually recover, but at the state level, Colorado Parks and Wildlife typically doesn't have the resources to put a lot of and they don't have the same jurisdictional authority that the federal government does to do things like declare critical habitat. And so essentially these species teetering on the edge of becoming federally listed, and if you're losing them sort of locally, they just don't get the same amount of support. So it's a nice step for us to be engaged in as a zoo. And so a fair question is, so what? I would bet that very few people in this room have seen a boreal toad, right? Maybe some of you have, which is, they're awesome. And, you know, like a fair question that somebody could ask is like, who cares? Like, so fine, we lose this toad, I don't know, we have other frogs. And let me give you, this probably a pretty receptive audience to this, so, and it's worth talking through. So what? Well, first off, they're just really cool. So let me tell you why they're really cool. So, they smell like peanut butter. No joke. Some people don't think they do, but some people think they do. So they, you know, that's funny. At the zoo, they live in a fridge for 6 months. And that's because they hibernate, so they brumate, is what it's called, brumation. Like if you're a cold-blooded ectotherm and you're at 12,000 feet, you're gonna go into hibernation, or brumation. So at the zoo, we mimic that by putting them in a fridge for 6 months. This is just a normal commercial fridge that we drill the holes in to get ventilation. And here they're doing a wellness check to see that they're doing okay, because essentially they're going, in a fridge and sit in these Tupperwares for 6 months and just hang out. And then when they come out of hibernation, it's like spring break and they copulate for days. The females will lay up to 8,000 eggs at a time. So 3,000 to 8,000 eggs per time when they lay eggs is what females do, right? They come straight out of brumation, copulate, lay eggs, thousands.
Are those the little dots? Those are eggs?
Yeah, they are. And we'll come back to this. Yeah, so each one, you can't quite see it that well, but each of these little black dots is an egg. And so you get these strands, they almost look like kind of worms with, there's just thousands and thousands of eggs. The tadpoles look like that. The metamorphs are really cute. Look, it's got chubby cheeks. We worked with Christy Oding, you'll see her name up here. She's a photographer. She's a really amazing photographer, and she went on a mission to get like photos of tadpoles. And so we got some really amazing ones. And then she gave prints to all the team. It was great. Christy's phenomenal. And then you look at like, you think the metamorphs are cute, but like look at these like toadlets, and they like metamorph out. Like they're just tiny little guys. They're the size of my like thumbnail. And so they're just really cute and really hard to find also, but really cute. And then they live for 20 years. So they're just like this awesome species. And even if you're like cold-blooded or cold-hearted, scientist like I was trained to be, and you say, you shouldn't anthropomorphize and care about that they smell like peanut butter, you should care that they're an indicator species for wetland health, which they are, right? So when we look at wetlands, right, we can say amphibians, they're like sponges, they breathe through their skin. They're just like living sponges. The first thing that's gonna go wrong in a wetland, the first thing you'll see is an amphibian. And what they're telling us, what Boreal toads is telling us is that something has gone wrong. And so that is what we're trying to solve. So how are we gonna try to save the species from going extinct here in the state? We're going to start with a problem statement, is that there are a lot of things we can't do. So we have no ability to treat infected animals. So once a toad is infected, there's nothing we can do for it. It's just going to die. So we can't treat infected animals. There's no way we can get rid of chytrid from a wetland. Once it's there, the spores are in the mud, like I can't get rid of mud in a wetland, right? So I can't get rid of it. We can't stop its spread. That was Colorado Park, like CPW's, Colorado Parks and Wildlife. That was their approach for the first 20 years or so, was like, hey, let's try to stop the spread. We'll try to isolate it. And the problem is you can't stop moose or deer or beavers from picking up mud in their fur and then walking to other wetlands. And that's what happens, right? So there's no way, even if you do closures and you do whatever you want, right? Like there's just mud gets around. It goes downstream also, right? And so there's just no way to either treat animals that are infected, get rid of it out of a wetland once it's infected, or stop the spread. So what are we gonna do? All right, what's a conservationist to do? The only way that I see forward is that we have to help the toads evolve resistance, or resilience. Those are technically two things, but we won't worry about that too much. What we want the toads to be able to do is the only solution that I see forward is that the toads just have to evolve to be able to like live with this disease without dying, right? And we'll get to that in a sec. But the good thing is it's happening in Utah. So we've seen it in Boreal toads. Boreal toads in Utah do seem to be responding better, including we're starting to see some genetic signatures of it, which is pretty cool. So there was a professor, Sarah Corder-Rivas, out of New Mexico Highlands University, and she took a couple of toads from Utah, a couple of toads from Colorado, exposed them to chytrid, and then looked at gene expression across the whole genome. And essentially, the Colorado toads just kind of went haywire. Like they went into like a generalized immune response, but nothing really targeted, and almost putting themselves into like a state of shock, like they were just responding so hard. And Utah toads had a very different response. They had a very targeted response, specifically expressing antifungal genes And so we've seen chytrid resistance both in the field and now with some genetic data showing like, hey, this is a real thing, where they're able to do it. But we haven't seen it in Colorado yet. I'll say this photo won a Wildlife Photographer of the Year photo this year, or 2024. And those are tadpoles from western toads. It's from British Columbia. So same species, different subspecies. But, you know, and they're like kind of, that's my dream state, is just snorkeling through a wetland with millions of tadpoles. So anyway, so that's nice that I had this dream that we're gonna help like the species evolve resistance, but like how, right? Like how? I'm not some, you know, magician. I can't just do it. And so what we're doing is trying to capitalize on the species life history strategy, right? And I talked you through it briefly earlier, explaining how cool they are, right? Like they live for 20 years. They reach sexual maturity between like 5 and 7 years, which is also kind of amazing. Like a little toad, and they don't even like get ready to breed until they're almost 7 years old. Is like, that's kind of crazy. But then once they do, then they start laying, you know, huge clutches of eggs. So like 3,000 to 8,000 eggs, probably every other year. We're not quite sure if it's every year or every other year. If we take a conservative estimate of that, so, you know, roughly every other year for roughly 14 years, about 5,000 eggs, right? So 7 clutches in its lifetime. It's about 35,000 eggs per female in its lifetime. Now why do they lay so many eggs? Right? It's because they're expecting to replace itself. Like a female lays that many eggs, they expect like 1 male and 1 female to survive. So your typical egg survival to reproductive age is about 2 out of 35,000. And why is that? It's because they get eaten by everything, right? From snakes, fish, birds, this is even from a water beetle. A water beetle is eating these things. So, like predation, it's a real thing. Like essentially, each female toad is trying to flood the zone, right? They're just trying to like flood the system, put as many eggs out there, and just like, I hope a couple survive, like, good luck to you. But we can capitalize on that life history strategy. Because what we can do is that we can bring animals into the zoo. Here's our breeding facility at the zoo. We built this in 2021, and we brought 95 adult toads into the zoo. Where we got those toads from is what Colorado Parks and Wildlife has been doing, is doing their own efforts at reducing predation. And so what CPW does is it takes eggs out of the wild, brings them into the fish hatchery, usually in Alamosa, the Nazareth, the native aquatic species recovery facility, I think it is. Anyway, it's a fish hatchery to bring in and boreal toads, fish and boreal toads. And they take toad eggs out of the wild, raise them as tadpoles, and then release the tadpoles into the wild. And that's a way to reduce predation. What they've done in those is also kept some of those eggs into tadpoles and reared them into adults. So they have about 800 adults there. But they haven't been able to breed toads there in the fish hatchery. And that's because a fish is not a toad, and a toad is not a fish. And so when you're doing a fish hatchery, like toads have different requirements. And you're doing it and like, no, you know, I'm joking about it, but they're doing the best they can, right? Like they're set up for fish and then they kind of a side project on toads, and they just don't really have the facilities for it. And so, nor the expertise, because these guys are fish biologists. And there's a lot of fish biology that's, you know, they raise literally like 300,000 fish every year for wild release. And so when you're just doing that like ridiculously huge numbers game, where you're just trying to breed like 300,000 fish, you're like, I don't know, we lost 20,000 fish today, like, it's all right, right? But like toads aren't like that, right? Like they're long-lived, and you gotta take care of each individual, and that's where zoo staff is really amazing at. Like we have keepers who like live and breathe toads and frogs, right? And so they really focus on like, oh, we can figure out what this individual animal needs, and we can build a tank that's specific. And you know, they wrestle with like, I don't know, should we put the fridge at 36 degrees, 34 degrees? And I'm like, I have no idea. You know, so, but that's the kind of stuff they really think about, like the nuances of what it's like to really be a toad. And so we brought toads in from Utah that are chytrid resilient and tried to breed them at the zoo. And we finally succeeded in 2019. And we became the first institution to successfully breed toads in captivity, boreal toads in captivity. And once we had that success, then we said, okay, we're gonna breed. Actually, the funny thing on that, just as a side note, was we did that in 2019, and if you remember, there was a bomb cyclone. And so we brought we had the toads in the fridge. They come out of the fridge, they get these hormone injections. So there's like this whole like hormone cascade, which is also, we have veterinarians working on this. And it's very, very nuanced. And so like last year, they were like, oh man, we really screwed it up because we gave the male hormones 5 hours too late. And like that's the level of nuance of like, we gave the like females their injections, you know, at 8 p.m. last night, we give it at like 8 p.m. the next night to the males, and we shouldn't have given it at like 2 p.m. instead, right? So those are like the sort of nuance that it takes to be successful. And we kind of cracked that code in 2019. But when we first did it, so we gave the hormone injection, and then the bomb cyclone hit overnight, and then they laid eggs the next morning. And then we're like, was it the hormone injection or was it the bomb cyclone, right? So we could replicate the hormone injections, but the bomb cyclone, like, we can't control, right? So, but then the Utah Division of Wildlife started doing our protocols in 2020, and it worked. So then we're like, okay, it wasn't the bomb cyclone. It was good, it worked. So we built a breeding facility in 2021, took 95 adults from CPW and started breeding them. Long story short. And what this allows us to do is then escape predation. And so, which is the whole, like, remember that, like, only 2 out of 35,000 survive, right? So, and what that does is that it really gives, like, if you just think of what they need to evolve any sort of resilience, is that's a, like, straight up mutation. That's a purely random process, right? Mutations are, you know, they just happen randomly. And so you just need a whole lot of tadpoles to hope that one of them is going to have like a magic mutation that's going to give them some resilience. And you know, what we can do then is if we're allowing these tadpoles to go from a 2 in 35,000 chance of survival to, like, if we give them like 1 in 1,000 is a huge advantage, right? Even if they get eaten, after we release them, it's still a big, and the sort of further along that we can help them can move to avoid all this predation, especially in the early life stages. It really might give one of these a chance, like if one of these animals on one of these eggs or tadpoles has this like mutation that really gives them resilience, you know, in the wild it's got a, you know, 34,998 out of 35,000 chance of getting eaten. Now suddenly we can improve its odds of survival. Even if that doesn't, that's a random process, right? Mutation is a random process, and so whether we're successful or not is a random process. But even if it's not working to give them chytrid resilience, even if none of the tadpoles that we release have the mutation that we want, at least we're keeping the species on the landscape for now, right? Like we're releasing tadpoles in the wild, we're supplementing the population, and we had some actually really encouraging news from that for this year. So Colorado CPW had been doing this Head Start program, is what they call it, when they take eggs out of the wild into a fish hatchery, release some tadpoles. So they reintroduced a population of boreal toads into a wetland, and it wild established. It started reproducing this past year in 2024. And so this concept can work, which is great. And it also happened to be a wetland, the same wetland that we had released our tadpoles into in 2022. Our tadpoles were not the ones breeding because they were still several years away from reaching maturity. But the concept is working, right? Take toads, help them establish and reestablish wetlands. And that, at the very least, is at least keeping the species on the landscape. And as I said, it really is just a numbers game, right? Mutations are random. Tadpole releases are just a numbers game. Like, we just got to put enough tadpoles out there, hope that there is some mutation, at least keep the species on the landscape. And so we've released 3,470 tadpoles since 2022, which simultaneously is a lot and very little. We're still trying to figure out we're still fine-tuning the hormone injection protocol. They're actually very hard to, we're still making discoveries. Like, it turns out that some of the animals that we thought were males were actually females, so they were getting the wrong injections. Solving that, right, we learn through time. And again, these like fine-tuning the injection protocols down to like the timing down to a few hours, it matters. And so we're getting better at it. We released 2,218 tadpoles this year. And so we're getting better through time, right? And so what we're doing, we're definitely on the right track, and like we need to scale up by a lot. Or I'm hoping that we can have. The other thing is that there are a lot of like the males weren't doing their job, so we had females that were laying eggs. Like thousands of eggs, and only like 10% of those eggs were fertilized. And so, like, we're trying to solve it, like, well, why weren't the males doing their job of fertilizing those eggs? So we're getting better and better over time. It's a new project, and we're still learning. And there's a better way to do it. The random mutation game is not a high probability play, right? That is a low probability play. The ideal would be if we can find animals in the wild that are already resilient, they're already resistant to chytrid. If we could do that, then we could take take eggs from populations that already have chytrid resilience, raise them into adults at the zoo, and then breed them and release them. And because they have so many eggs, there's like, if you're talking about like you have an animal that's chytrid resilient and it's pumping out 5,000 eggs per year, you could rapidly start recovery, right? You could allow for a pretty rapid recovery. So sort of capitalizing on the life history strategy could allow us, not by some crazy selection experiment or some CRISPR insertion, just helping nature overcome the thing that we put a barrier in front of the species. So, but it does hinge on finding chytrid resilient populations. And that's not easy. Toads are hard to find. So we launched a community science or citizen science, community science program in 2022 to help us look for toads and look for wetlands. And it's, again, sort of like the wild releases, it has two goals. Just like the wild releases, what we're hoping is that we can help put some chytrid-resistant mutations, animals that have the right mutations that are chytrid resilient on the landscape. Even if that doesn't work, we're still just keeping animals on the landscape. And there's sort of a similar analogy here with our data collection. We're hoping to find chytrid resilient populations, because then we could accelerate this spread of those genes across the whole state to help the species recover. But even if we can't find them, in the meantime, we're just getting data to see how the population is doing, which is not a bad thing, right? I'm not sure that it's enough to get the species to recovery, but it's at least helping understand where we're at. And a lot of it, when you think about just what wetlands look like, and what a chytrid resilient population would look like, what it would look like is that you had a pond full of toads, and then disease swept in and killed practically all of them. And so now you just have a couple of toads left in a wetland. And these wetlands are like, 100 acres of willows with some water bodies scattered in between. Finding 2 toads and like 3 feet tall grass when you're bushwhacking through willows is really hard. You just need to like throw a lot of people power at it. You just need a lot of eyes in the field and boots on the ground looking to see, because if you have this chytrid resilient population, odds are we wouldn't find it, right? They used to be statewide. Now, most breeding sites, we have fewer than 10 breeding sites where there's more than 20 adult toads, like entire state. And so trying to find, again, you're just walking through some random wetland, essentially, just looking for toads, like your probability of success for finding these guys is not high. And so there is some chance that there's just these chytrid resilient toads like lurking in the background somewhere. But again, they're really susceptible at that point, because it could just be like, well, like a great blue heron come in and like picked off the female that's breeding, and that's that, right? So what we've done is train up this cadre of volunteers that we've had actually far exceeded my expectations, because I was like, we're doing this for a toad, like we'll be lucky if we get 20 people. In the first year, we had 248 people express interest, and 109 people actually show up in the field with us. So we've done 225 volunteers in the field. We've led 118 surveys, plus another 28 surveys of wetlands from volunteers. We found boreal toads at three locations that we thought that they were not there anymore, which also vastly exceeded my expectations. I thought we'd be lucky if we found a single place in like 5 years, and we found one in the first year and 2 in the second year, and one of them is a breeding site. And we've also tested 27 amphibians for chytrid, because we also want to see, like, with the gold standard, if you want to think through, like, what would chytrid resilient population look like to boots on the ground during the field? Like, I have no idea. Like, we don't know how to test for chytrid resilience. There's no, like, you know, barcode that could be like, are you chytrid resilient? Yes, no, right? Like, we got to figure that out. What it would look like in the field is that you're seeing toads in a wetland that's testing positive for chytrid, and you're seeing them reproduce and recruit into adulthood year after year. So we need multiple years of data. A lot of where chytrid animals get killed is where you see a lot of mortality, especially is from 0-year-olds, so like metamorphs, into 1-year-olds. They just never show up as 1-year-olds, and that's because the metamorph process takes so much energy that it consumes all their energy from their immune system, and so they're unable to really fight off a chytrid infection that like stronger, bigger animals are able to do. So functionally, what a lot of chytrid infection looks like on the ground is that you can sort of see this like ghost population. You see adults are recruiting eggs, but you're not seeing any new individuals being like 1-year-olds. You don't see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-year-olds. So that's what we're trying to look for. And you know what our goals with our community science program is, in part to just increase capacity, help biologists from CPW get and survey wetlands and get better understanding of where toads are. Because if we're finding 3 populations sort of in just a couple of years, that means we really don't know much about what's going on. We want to engage the community in helping the species in research, obviously increase awareness, and then the research priorities is survey target sites, test for chytrid presence, collect habitat, both for understanding what's good habitat so we can refine like where we should be searching, and for potential release sites where we should be releasing in the future. How that project operates on a more nuts and bolts level is that CPW gives us sites of priority wetlands that are like here, these like dots across the state where they want to have surveys. And then we work to figure out, and those are like whether historically occupied habitat. And then we try to figure out how we're gonna like divvy up survey effort, which sites can we get to. We try to get to identify like, hey, which are your top 10 to 15 sites for CPW, and then we try to get to them twice a year to get 2 surveys, train out volunteers how to do the work, and then volunteers can go out and independently survey. And you know, functionally, again, what that looks like for each like dot on that map is that what it actually looks like is that we, say, hey, there's a parking spot up there, and here's a trail you take to get, and then these are the actual areas and these polygons that you go survey. Once we're in the wetland, like this wetland, we go and record data, both on habitat characteristics, about the water bodies and other stuff. If we catch toads or other amphibians, then we swap, because there's chorus frogs, and there's tiger salamanders, there's boreal toads, there's wood frogs, and we swab those for chytrid, and then record what we find. So, do you find amphibians? Did you swab them for chytrid, label it? There's a boreal tail getting its belly swabbed. And then we're putting in these test tubes and ship them off for chytrid testing. So, and the good news out of all of this is that CPW might have found a chytrid resilient population. We're not sure. And we're seeing eggs, we're seeing multiple years of eggs, even with chytrid positive. The risk there is that it's just this kind of dying population when they're not being recruited in. So that's the next step, is to figure out, like, are we getting recruitment? Are we getting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-year-olds? And then the second, but even if we see that, what we have to figure out is that how much of a genetic basis is there, right? Like, the whole principle of trying to spread chytrid-resistant genes requires that there's genetic basis for the chytrid resistance, and maybe there's just like, maybe some magic wetland that has some particular characteristic that allows chytrid to, like, or is not good for chytrid, right? So it could be that it's actually not a genetic basis at all, it's more just a habitat characteristic. That itself would be interesting, because then we can say, like, other things that we could do to, like, improve other wetland habitats to match those characteristics. But either way, there's a lot more, we're cautiously hopeful, cautiously optimistic, but, we have to, there's a lot more data that we need to actually see. And then, there's a lot of weaknesses with this approach. It's not easy to try to bring species back from the brink. And, the first challenge is that you need 20 years of continuous funding, right? Like, we need, like, this isn't a one-year project. We're like, okay, we bred them and released them and we're done, right? Like, we brought the species back statewide. Like, that's not a one-year project, that's not a 2-year project, that's not a 5-year project, that's not a 10-year project, that's a 20-year timeline, right? And like, I'm from Sweden, and there's this great Swedish drinking song, and it says, you can't have your second drink until you have the first, right? Which is true, you can't. And same way, you can't have 20 years of funding until you have 19 years of funding, right? You can't have 19 years of funding until you have 18 years of funding, right? And you think about, you're going through this project, and you're not seeing any success for the first 12 years, and then the Great Recession hits, and you have to not have the project cut, right? 20 years of funding, there's just a lot of things that can go wrong in 20 years. The other thing is that extirpation might happen first. Like, the species might just disappear from the landscape before we're successful. Low detection probability of finding them just makes everything harder. We're releasing tadpoles. We have no way to mark tadpoles. There's no one on the planet who knows how to mark a tadpole that you can then say, hey, are your tadpoles surviving? Right? And so somebody's like, hey, we want to see whether your stuff is working, and we're like, well, I don't know. Like, right? Like, it's really hard, right? Because A, they're really hard to find, and then once you mark a tadpole, like, they metamorph and change into something else. We've talked about releasing later, like holding them back for another year, so releasing 1-year-olds. You can pin tag 1-year-olds. The concern is that it's really important, like, there are a lot of aquatic species that really kind of imprint on the wetland, and the concern is that like, they both need, like, microbiomes, which is really important, we know that. Microbiomes, like, on their skin is really important, and so if you're just kind of denying them that opportunity to, like, have a natural microbiome when they're growing up, and they don't imprint, there are potential risks of keeping them for longer. But that means that it's really hard to measure success. And then there's a paper that came out that there's very low genetic diversity in the species in Colorado. And that's a problem, because, like, mutations, like, and genetic recombination, like how you create raw new genetic material, you need variants, you need variation in genes, and they just might not have genetic diversity. And the reality is, we have to get all of these right? If any one of these goes wrong, like, we're hosed, right? So it's hard, right? Like, but what's a conservationist to do? Like, what else are we gonna do, right? Like, we either do nothing and then let the species blink out, or we do the best we can. And I think that the positive side of this is we look at this, what can we do, right? Here's first gentleman, Marlon Reese. In the first year in 2022, when we first had our first full year of breeding program, he's been an awesome ally. What we can do is create an insurance population, We can breed them. This one's getting an ultrasound, by the way. So that's it's belly ripped. Are you pregnant? Do we need to give you more injections? We can then release tadpoles into the wild, recruit volunteers to help us, decontaminate our boots, right? Don't spread chytrid from wetland to wetland is one of our training for volunteers is how do you sterilize your boots, decontaminate them. Most important is to have fun. And the last is to flip the paradigm. Remember the conservation paradigm I told you? People are always the problem. We can also make people the answer. We can make people the solution. Right? We can help breed toads. We can help search for chytrid resilient toads and help breed and expand their genetics. We can make people the solution. And so if you want to join us, that's a QR code for signing up, and you can also just go to denverzoo.org/community science. And there's my email address, and with that, there's 10 minutes for questions.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So why the hormone injections?
Yeah, so the question for, if you didn't hear it on Zoom, is why the hormone injections? And so my honest answer is twofold. So one is I don't know. Well, I should say I do know, in that if you just take them out of bromation without giving hormone injections, their breeding success is super low. And so what we know is that it's needed. Why is it needed? I'm not quite sure. You know, a zoo environment is not the wild. And so it is like triggering whatever sort of other cues, abiotic cues that they're getting. Somehow it's not sufficient, and so we could, and if you get some breeding, you don't get the same level of breeding, so we can certainly ratchet up breeding with the hormone injections. And it's really fascinating talking to the vets who do it, right? Like they really think through like gonadotropin hormones and when you it's pretty cool. In a former master's project, I used to do like some hormone work, and so, but they're like, I was like a child at it, and they're like experts, so it's fun to talk to them about it. Yeah.
If the Utah toads are resistant, what would be the issues of bringing some of them to Colorado?
Yeah, so for those online who didn't hear it, so the question is, if the Utah toads are resistant, what's the problem with bringing some of those to Colorado? And so the biggest thing is that they are genetically different. So it's a different clade here in Colorado than in Utah. And it's a one-way door, right? You can't, we can walk through that door, but we can't walk back out of it, right? Once we bring in genetics and intermix them, we can't undo that decision that they're intermixed. And so that is one of the things that land managers are talking about, like should we do that? New Mexico, that is one thing that New Mexico is doing. New Mexico's already lost a species, and they're like, well, it's better to have, a slightly different clade than it is but the same species, the same subspecies, and nothing at all, right? So New Mexico is starting that route. Colorado, we're hoping we don't have to go down that route. Because it is like, you can't undo that decision if later you realize there's something else, right? So plus we're better than Utah, so. Yeah.
Online question. We hear what we think are toads in the summer here in Estes at 7,700 feet. What species do you think that is?
Yes, if you hear them, they're almost certainly chorus frogs. So the boreal toads are very quiet. Actually, one of the few ways that you can in hand identify a female from a male is that the male will chirp, but it's not very loud. They kind of give like, but it's not nearly the same kind of like a chorus frog. So what you're hearing is almost certainly chorus frogs.
So are there boreal toads here in the Estes Valley watershed? And then also, can you say what the clade is?
Yeah, so the question is, are there toads here in the Estes Valley watershed? And then what the clade is. So this is the Southern Rockies clade of the boreal toad, that's the clade. Off the top of my head, I'm trying to remember if we have any, so I don't know off the top of my head if we have any, if we have any sites with, in the Estes Valley watershed. There are sites on the other side of Rocky, on the west side of Rocky. There are also still chytrid negative wetlands in the park near here. Actually some near, there's a site right next to Bear Lake that's chytrid negative, which is kind of remarkable, right? Because it gets so much foot traffic. And where they've released tadpoles, like from the Head Start program. So there are some populations, drug populations around here, though I don't know exactly in the watershed. But there are populations nearby. Yeah.
They did find one out in the North Fork of the Big Thompson, out of that watershed a few years back.
Cool. Yeah, so the comment was that they found one in the North Fork of the Big Thompson. What's kind of cool is they can actually go up to 17 miles. And so you don't think like it's a toad, but they've crossed the continental divide. Yeah, they're pretty remarkable little guys. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm curious about the situation in Korea where the fungus comes from.
Yeah.
So how's their amphibian populations, and are they also crashing in Korea?
Yeah, so the question was if populations in Korea, well, how amphibian populations in Korea are doing, given that that's the origin of the disease. Amphibian populations in Korea are doing great, and that's because they co-evolved with chytrid. And so that's really the central challenge here is that when we moved and introduced this new pathogen, there just hasn't been time for the species to co-evolve with it. And some species, obviously, they didn't make it, right? Like they went extinct. There are 90 species, a lot in Central America and South America that didn't make it through their process and were driven extinct by it. But essentially, and maybe that happened in evolutionary time in South Korea, right? In Korea in 200,000 years ago. Maybe they had the amphibian apocalypse when chytrid emerged, right? And essentially all we're seeing are the survivors of that apocalypse, right? Long story short, like species that have this like long coevolutionary history are totally fine with it. And it's all like chorus frogs are mostly fine with it. Like their bullfrogs are invasive, but also aren't really affected by chytrid. So there's a lot of species that do okay with it. Like woodhouse toad basically looks almost exactly like a boreal toad, but it's just below 8,000 feet. They're doing totally fine. But if you have in hand, you can't tell a boreal toad from a woodhouse toad. So it's kind of strange how there's just, there's some species that are just way better able to cope with a disease than other species.
Can you identify the factors that make that species, for example, immune to chytrid versus what's happening with the boreal toad?
Yeah, so the question is if we can identify the factors that allow some species to live with chytrid. Long story short, I don't know what the factors are. There's probably genetic basis of like which genes are being expressed. Maybe somebody understands it better than I do. To me, it seems totally random. And there might be, there are also many things I don't know. So maybe somebody else knows that, but I don't. Yeah.
Online question. She wants to know how they find each other during mating season if they don't make sounds.
Ooh. I don't know. Maybe they just go to the same wetland.
She suggested scent, but I didn't.
Yeah, so it might be scent, like the peanut butter smell. It's a thing. They also tend to be pretty. So now when you find them, they're pretty picky about their wetlands, or like not the wetland, but the water body. So they really like dark soil, like it's warmed up, like from solar heating. They like emerging vegetation, so they like when you have like grass that's going from the bottom up through the surface of the water. They don't like water that's too deep, in part because that has a lot of fish, so there's more predation, and more tiger salamanders, which are also a big predator. So it might just be a habitat selection. So the short answer is I don't know. And it might just be that like once they're in the right water body that they all like, and are picking on water temperature or chemical signatures or whatever they're picking up on, that they're, yeah, let's just congregate there. But I don't know. It's a great question.
It's kind of related to that. So if they're congregating there, in this particular wetlands, then if you find them, are they likely to kind of venture out and go to something else that's around there then, or do we even know? I mean, are they happy to stay forever, or do they want to go out and explore?
Yeah, so the question is like once you find them, do they stay in this one kind of water body or do they go out and explore? They're certainly so they go far distances, right? Like they go for, the documented 17-mile long dispersals, which means that it might be going for much longer than that. We just haven't seen it yet, right? Or we haven't detected it. So but it's also true that like year on year, there are clearly water bodies. Like you go in a wetland and like it's this complex of little old beaver ponds and water bodies and it's just a one, and they're always there, year on year on year on year. And so they are, even if I think what they do is they probably like to, or maybe, is that they like to breed there, and then they'll go on and elsewhere, but they're pretty picky about, certainly where they hang out in the breeding season. And then they might disperse out later. And that might be, one of the sort of interesting things is that this was a habitat generalist, right? It used to be like in every wetland, like you used to like hang out in Buena Vista, like which is not ideal wetland habitat. But now they look like specialists. And so maybe that's some sort of chytrid effect of like, maybe it's just like, it's only these specific things that, so chytrid loads tend to go down when it's warmer. And so they might be like picking like warm sites. So there are like places where they started building frog saunas, like there are frog species that are being knocked out by chytrid, and they're literally black wooden boxes with little frog-sized holes in them, where frogs that get warm because they're like black, right? And the frogs will voluntarily go in there and just cook themselves real bit, right? And just like go into a frog sauna, and that really knocks down their chytrid load. And so it might just be like so it might be chytrid sort of driving this, what was a generalist, a habitat generalist, to become a habitat specialist to focus on like where their lowest chytrid loads. It's, because it's counterintuitive, like we have to look for these very, very, very specific things in wetlands and you kind of get an eye for them after you've been out there for a while. But like this was a species that was just everywhere and super common, and so those two things don't jive. But I think once you're down at this low population level, they get, who knows? Yeah.
So just to think it from a bigger perspective, like climate change, amphibians are really getting impacted. So what's that correlation to the chytrid or just the decline because of, maybe the change in precipitation, temperature? Is there information on that?
Yeah, so the question is around, how's climate change affecting chytrid and world toad populations in general? So there are a few different ways to think about it. So one is that they're really dependent on the hydro period, right? On like how long the wetland stays wet, right? Which many wetlands dry out, right? They're wet during the spring, snow melt, and then dry out over time, right? Like so, as hydro periodicity changes due to climate change, is like, melting snowpack goes down or melts earlier, you get warmer, so that's 100% gonna affect them. I don't personally know how it's gonna like specifically play out. What I can say on a general level is certainly the case when you have something like chytrid that's wiping out 99% of habitat, and so they're down to just these few patches. Those few patches are way more vulnerable, right? So now if something happens to knock out like this one wetland, we think we have some chytrid resilience, like if who knows, there's a landslide, or there's whatever, right? Like, something happens to that one wetland, there's a huge fire, whatever could happen, right? You're way more, the system as a whole, and the species as a whole is way less resilient to these other disturbances that happen, including climate change and all the sort of ways that's gonna play out.
Yeah, why did the Alaska and British Columbia population do so well?
So the question is, why is Alaska and British Columbia populations doing so well? I'm not totally sure. I think chytrid is lower prevalence there. I think it's just better habitat in some ways. It's way wetter, right? Obviously, in like the Pacific Northwest is much wetter than Colorado. And you see it like when you look at those, remember that, I'll try to pull back to it, like that photo of all those tadpoles, like those are really fat, juicy tadpoles. We don't usually see tadpoles that look like that. And I've heard people comment on that, be like, oh man, in the Pacific Northwest, like those tadpoles, just really big monsters. Oh, they're just good. Yeah, where's it? Oh, there it is. Yeah, so these are really fat, juicy tadpoles. So anyway, point is, that like tadpoles just don't grow that fat in Colorado, and that's probably some degree of habitat thing. So I think it's in part, so I'm not entirely sure is the short answer. And then on conjecture, I'm guessing that there's some combination of, there's like better habitat because it's just much more wet. And so they're probably more resilient to other sort of diseases coming in. And so if they're able to fight it off, there might be genetic components also. So I'm not 100% sure why, but I could make up stories, or at least one of my answers.
Is chytrid expanding?
Yes, is chytrid expanding? It is. So it showed up in so many places though. It showed up in, it's wiping out amphibians in South America, Central America, Africa, Europe. That photo from National Geographic was from France, North America. So yeah, it's kind of, it is already pretty much everywhere.
When did you find it here?
It was first, so chytrid, so the question is when we first find chytrid here. So it was first found in 70s or 80s, and first found in a few places, and then nobody knew what was causing die-offs. And there was actually some thought that like maybe the act of searching was actually, because we didn't know what was causing it, was actually spreading chytrid, because we're going into chytrid-infected wetlands and then going into other wetlands. So anyway, it's been seen in Utah since at least the 70s, and so we've had chytrid-infected wetlands in Utah since the 70s. It's roughly the center of Colorado.
Yeah, I had one more related to climate change thing. As it gets hotter and we have more wildfires coming through these, do we know anything about how wildfires affect some of these areas? Or is there, I mean, is it just kind of standard, fires go through, wetlands, make it or they don't? Is there any implication or anything you can say about that related to the toads?
Yeah, so the question was, for online was, how is climate change, specifically increase of fire, changing toads or chytrid? So there is people have started looking at how wildfire affects chytrid. So I don't quite know, it's pretty new, those studies are pretty new. I know people are looking at it, I don't know what the results have been yet. They're certainly thinking that if you wipe out, so in some ways, like, if you wipe out all amphibians, you could actually, like, they mostly persist, chytrid might go away after a while. Like, spores have some degree of, they have a life expectancy themselves, like, right? And so if you kill off all the source animal, like the source adults, like the hosts, eventually you might actually sterilize the wetland. And so there might be some effect from that, from fire, but obviously, like, killing off the thing that you're trying to save is not a great way to save it.
Is the zoo trying to perpetuate the species, obviously? Do they have any milestones at which they say, okay, that's it, or?
Yeah, so we don't have any, so the question was, right, do we have milestones at which we either change what we're doing, right? And so not yet. And I think it's been a really awesome project for bringing kind of a whole organization behind it. And so, which has been really phenomenal, and it's really, you know, meaningful to keepers, to, you know, animal keepers, and to really like directly contribute. You know, and you know, a lot of those like men and women have said like, oh man, the moment I released the tadpole was like career highlight, like best thing I've ever done in my career. And so it's been really meaningful, which I think has been awesome. And I think honestly is like gonna be different. Like that has allowed us to avoid hard conversations, right? It's been such an awesome thing that maybe in 10 years, like we'll have be like sort of be more clear-eyed about like,
Yeah.
hey, this is not working, do we continue doing this? Or is this just like a core thing that like, nope, we're, you know, like, so I think it's gonna be interesting to see. And, you know, for ourselves, I mean, what I would love to see is us be able to, the milestones that I see is I would be, love for us to be able to have like a wetland first, or with a wetland that we, the zoo can say like, we brought toads back here, right, to this specific place. And solely through our efforts, and then sort of be like, now that we've done that, we're gonna go to the next one, and right, and be able to do that, I mean, if all my dreams come true, and then we'd be able to do that with like breeding chytrid resilient toads, and so we can be like, yes, these are the toads that are gonna sort of help perpetuate the species and be resistant and resilient to
It's quite an
chytrid.
accomplishment.
It would be, and it, you know, you have to think through sort of decade-long
Oh, sure.
time spans to do that. And I'm comfortable with that. So, you know, it's just what you sign up for, right?
Yeah.
Like, cause the glass is 10% full.
Well, this was fascinating.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you everybody for coming here tonight, inviting me.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah.